Okay, so you should have just watched a little clip from one of my favorite movies, Kenneth Branagh's Henry V, and this is a speech that he gives in the 15th century, right? Agincourt. This is a speech that he gives, Henry V gives when he's about to go to war with France in order to get the land that he claims that the English kings own in France, and he rallies his troops to him. And why did we start with that quote, Dr. McFall?
So he starts out with three different quotes, right?
Yeah.
At the very beginning of the book.
Yeah.
And
so this is one of those epigraphs on page
exactly
before the
table of contents.
before the table of contents.
And those epigraphs are really very interesting because that speech, and if you watch as you watch the clip as opposed to just this little excerpt of it, right? It talks about they're fighting for their honor, and gaining honor through fighting. They are fighting for their memory so that they will be remembered throughout the next years and decades and maybe even centuries. And it suggests, in a sense, that war is a good thing. Or if maybe not war is a good thing, at least fighting in a war for a good cause is a good thing to do, and one that people will remember you for and value and honor you for.
And the line, the phrase that comes out of this speech that's probably the most famous because it was a title of a book by William Ambrose, or Stephen Ambrose, was the Band of Brothers.
Mm-hmm.
That war is something you do as a social activity with other men, and it forges this band of brothers. And let's look at the other epigraphs, because they don't go along with that at all.
No.
The first one is from the book of Joel, which is one of those small little, like, two-page books of prophecy in the Old Testament. Joel is probably writing shortly before the destruction of Israel, the northern kingdom. And he's talking about the horrible destruction that's going to come. Yeah. And it's awful. I mean, it's fire and brimstone. The Old Testament prophets were not cheery fellows. He says, in the middle of this apocalypse, in the middle of this holocaust of flame and fire, your old men shall dream dreams, your young men shall see visions. That there's something about the intensity of this war that is going to give the gift of prophecy, both to old men and to young men. Mm-hmm. And how does this play out?
That plays out throughout the book, right?
Yeah.
Because so it's not the first thing he says in the book, but the second scene in the book is in fact a dream, right? Or a vision, however you want to imagine it, where his present day self meets again the person he had been during the war, right? The sergeant, right? So it's the sergeant and the old man.
So it's a young man and an old man.
Oh, sorry, the sergeant and it's the old man as he is now, and the sergeant as a young man.
The old man's dreaming a dream.
Yes.
So the young man was having visions.
Yeah, what vision is he having? Right? That's one of the really interesting things, because the vision, and watch for this because it is scattered throughout the book. There will be scenes of this dream or other dreams like it, right? And the vision that the young man has is for an America that is more just, that is more wealthy, or comfortable, or prosperous, or whatever you want to use, right? He's imagining a world which is a better world to live in, right? That's what the younger man is visioning. And the older man is then forced through this literary device, and it's hard to say whether he actually had these dreams or not. I suspect he did. We can talk more about what a memoir means in a moment. But assuming he had these dreams, the old man is forced to confront the fact that the visions that the young man had, which in some ways are what he's fighting for, never come true. Or at least Manchester doesn't think they come true.
Which sort of leads us to the third epigraph from Winston Churchill, who had something to do with World War II.
Yes, indeed. And World War I.
And World War I. And the Boer War.
So it's worth talking about Churchill, right? Because he goes off as a war correspondent as a young man, and he thinks that, like Hemingway, right? He and Hemingway actually are very similar in terms of their personalities and the way they try and present themselves to the world, right? Churchill, as well, is a man's man, right? He gets up in the morning and he has a shot of something for breakfast and for lunch and for dinner, because that's what men do, right? And And he had gone off as a war correspondent and participated in battles everywhere. And he, as a young man, imagined that war would be glorious, that he would be reporting on heroism and courage and achievement and honor, all of the things that Kenneth Branagh talked about. And yet, here, right, read the
War, which was cruel and glorious, has become cruel and sordid.
Here's this guy who saw military combat as making men, now sees it as destroying men.
And this was the good war.
Yep.
I mean, he didn't even
Exactly.
see Vietnam.
Yeah.
He didn't see what was happening in Iraq. This was the war that and of all the wars that we fought, this is like, the coolest one.
Yeah. And so this is the war, the only war in American history which did not have a significant anti-war movement.
Yeah.
This is a war in which there are clear villains to fight, right? And so Hitler's the most obvious one, right? And so and as he said, Manchester says in the book, nobody really thought about fighting the Japanese. They were all getting ready. If America was going to go to war, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, the war they were going to fight was about Hitler and to oppose the aggression by the Germans and the mistreatment by the German of, at least in their imagination in 41, of the French citizens and the Belgian citizens and of English civilians in towns like Coventry, which the German Air Force bombs to at least into ruins. This is the imagination. And even during the Pacific War, the imagination is that they are fighting against devils who have no regard for human rights, who rape their captives, who disembowel their captives. The kind of iconic moment for Americans is the Bataan Death March, right? And he'll talk about Bataan, or he did, I think already in this book, talk about Bataan as this little peninsula in the Philippines where American and Australian and Filipino soldiers held out. Once they finally surrendered, they are marched across tens of miles, in the process of which hundreds and thousands of people died and or are killed by the Japanese. And so this vision of this merciless conqueror who treats people like animals who you have to defeat.
And let's put some propaganda posters up.
Yes.
While we're talking, we look at some of this. We've shown you some of these, but from World War I. But let's look at the World War II anti-Japanese propaganda.
And so there's
posters.
two kind of broad tropes to notice here, and one actually goes back to that Band of Brothers speech.
Mm-hmm.
And there are dozens of these. We're only going to show you a couple that all appeal to the "where were you" part, right? Because in the speech, not in the epigraph, but in the speech, he talks about how all of those people in England who have not fought are not going to enjoy this honor and reputation that you get, right? And this is exactly what the American government and all of the governments play on this, are trying to remind you. How are you going to get the girl? How are you going to have your family celebrate you if you spend the war at home in a safe job?
Where were you, Daddy?
Yeah. But the other trope
At
isn't,
at the same time, they've got to convince people that those safe jobs are part of the war effort,
yes.
too.
And there's a whole series of propaganda posters which are meant to convey the message that workers are actually soldiers. Yeah. Right? And
We'll put a few of those up,
yeah.
too.
And in particular, there's one where the tool that the guy is using is lined up and the shadow looks exactly like a gun. Yeah. Right. But the other trope is exactly, as you said, is this idea that the Japanese are barbarians who are doing barbaric things and they must be destroyed. Yep.
Subhuman. The posters are all...
Yes.
Yeah.
And we'll throw one, so there's one I will throw out from about Lidice, which is this small town in Czechoslovakia, which is destroyed after one of the Nazi leaders who's actually in charge of what is called the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. Just think of that as the Czech Republic.
Heydrich?
That's right, Heydrich.
Yeah.
And he's assassinated. And the result is that the Germans, in retaliation, simply destroy this town and kill all of the men in it and deport the women and children. Right? That's the enemy. This is the good war. Mm-hmm. And yet, here's this quote that starts this book.
So taken together, these three quotes give us a very conflicted picture of war. Mm-hmm. It produces visions. It is cruel and sordid, and yet there's this camaraderie, there's this band of brothers that comes out of it. So that, I mean, take that as you will, but think of that as you read the book,
Exactly.
because the book, these are all here for very good reasons,
Yep.
because the book has a number of some very strange visions, actually. It shows a certain sordidness, and he's going to come to the conclusion that we fight for our brothers. We're not fighting for the government. We're not fighting for a cause. We're not fighting for ideas. We're fighting for the 6 people around us who we were in basic training together, and we're trying to get through.
And so it is important to remember here that Manchester is one of the literary greats of the 20th century, right? Not in the way that Remarque or Hemingway was, right? He's not a fictional, he doesn't write fiction. He's a journalist, and so he writes newspaper article after article. He writes more typical history. He wrote a biography of MacArthur. He wrote, or was in the process of, a biography of Churchill when he passed away.
Yeah, American Caesar. Is
Yes.
his biography of MacArthur, which is definitive.
Yes.
I mean, it's the great biography of
He
General
writes nonfiction beautifully.
Yeah.
And he knows what he's doing. So assume that anything he writes is intentional and well thought out and placed specifically. Which brings us to the very first scene in the book, right? Because you get the epigraphs, then you get the table of contents. Then the very first thing you see is his memory of the first person he shot. And that's a really interesting memory. Is that a heroic scene, do you think? It's not.
No,
really,
I wouldn't say that it's heroic. I mean, I think that it's sort of desperate.
Yeah.
You know, there's a desperation here. He didn't shoot this person in the name of freedom.
Right.
He shot this person because it was a very confusing situation. He was terrified, and somehow he managed to shoot first.
Yeah, exactly. And the first thing you see is how frightened he is.
Yeah.
Right. This is not our kind of archetypal hero who intends to go out in a blaze of glory. He's scared to death.
Audie Murphy.
Yeah. Whose memoir actually is very well written and very worth reading if you get a chance. One of the things to read. So the one sentence takeaway of Audie Murphy is that a lot of heroes are heroes because they're so tired that they don't care.
Yeah.
Right. In this case, he's scared, but he knows he's got to do something, right? And he doesn't win because he's better. That's the thing, right? Because he charges through the door and he realizes that he's in an unoccupied room, and the other guy now knows that he's there, and so he doesn't have any choice. He plows ahead, he breaks through the next door, and this poor guy is caught in the sling that he's using to support a sniper rifle, and he just kind of backs away in fear, and Manchester fires and kills him, not because he's better, but because this other guy is just kind of tangled.
And they're both scared to death.
Yeah.
They're both confused.
Exactly.
And he kills him.
Yeah.
Yeah. Not particularly heroic.
Mm-hmm.
But why does he start with that? What's he setting up here?
I think that goes along with the sense of how conflicted he is about the war effort, right? That this scene is meant to establish that he survived when other people didn't, not because of skill and not because of courage, but because of luck. Yeah. And that doesn't mean he didn't have skill, right? And we'll talk about that as we go along. Just that in the war in the Pacific, skill in the end didn't really matter, or mattered very little.
Let's talk about that, because the war in the Pacific was in some ways very, very different from the war in Germany.
Yeah.
And he talks in here about how nobody thinks of themselves as fighting the Japanese. They're here to fight Hitler.
Yeah.
But there were prisoners of war in World War II.
Mm-hmm.
Kurt Vonnegut was a prisoner of war. There weren't any prisoners of war in the Japanese
There were very
theater.
few.
And why is that?
There were so just broaden out just briefly. There are really only one set of prisoners that last any amount of time at all in World War II, and that is white Westerners who get captured by other white Westerners, right? Whether that's Germans getting captured by the British, whether that's Americans getting captured by the Germans. In that case, all of them are seen as equal as humans and are treated reasonably well.
Not as good as in Hogan's Heroes.
Not in Hogan's Heroes, but if you are a Pole or a Russian captured by the Germans, your lifespan expectancy is minimal. If you are a German captured by the Russians, same kind of thing. if you are a Chinese captured by the Japanese, or American captured by the Japanese, or Japanese captured by the Americans. In all of these cases, your lifespan is likely to be short. Right? And that is largely because each side saw the other as something other than human.
What that does is as I read it, it takes out any kind of individual agency. You're not going to survive by your wits. If you're on the winning side, then you will completely annihilate the other side. And if you're not, no matter how good you are, nothing you do is going to matter in this kind of warfare.
That's right. And that comes clear as you read, and you're only halfway through to this point, but it will become clear increasingly as you go on that combat is not seen as something you can, in the Pacific, right? Because this is fought on islands rather than on a broad continent.
So why don't you just kind of go over the strategy?
Yeah. So,
what was the island hopping?
The first thing to
Pacific
remember
theater?
is that until the war with Germany is done, the Pacific theater was always second in terms of supplies, in terms of manpower, in terms of attention. Right? And all of the Marines and the soldiers who are fighting in the Pacific all recognize that they are a second priority. And the war in the Pacific is actually very easy to explain because there are 6 months where the Japanese run wild, and he talks about this in the book, and there are some maps in the book, and establish a defensive perimeter thousands of miles into the Pacific. And the rest of the war is about the Allies, the British and the Americans and the Australians primarily, battering away at this perimeter, gradually pushing them back.
What's the overall objective of the Japanese?
Well, they don't know.
Okay.
This is the really interesting thing. The initial objective, so if you back up even further, the World War II really starts in 1931. Okay. And we think of it conventionally starting in 1939 when Germany invades Poland. But in fact, it started in 1931 when the Japanese engineer an incident in China, which they use to carve out an empire in China. And really, if you have to make their war effort logical, their war effort is to become a self-sustaining, autarkic imperial power in East Asia. And the Americans matter only to the degree to which they want to get it stand in the way of them. Right.
And is America's trip point the Philippines?
Yes.
Okay.
More or less.
So why Pearl Harbor?
Well, remember that the United States is not the enemy; it's just standing in the way of the enemy. Right. Yeah. So the Japanese knew they needed resources, oil in particular. The way to get those resources within Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Thailand, and so on, Indonesia, what is now Indonesia, Singapore, they knew they had to take the Philippines to do this. They knew that would trigger American intervention. So the idea is that you hit America hard, give America a bloody nose, stun it, carve out a defensive perimeter far into the Pacific, and make it too costly for the Americans to recover that. And then sit and wait for the Americans to realize it didn't really make sense to spend the time and the energy and the blood to take all of this territory back just for something China they didn't care about. And so Pearl Harbor was supposed to be a quick jab in the nose to stun America until they came, and then by the time they came to their senses, they would realize it wasn't worth fighting anymore. And what Japan didn't count on was that America would decide, and Americans really would decide, that it was worth paying the price. And at that point, Japan doesn't have a strategic objective because
so they're just trying to hold.
Yeah, they are hoping somehow that maybe America will get tired, and that's the extent to which their strategic planning makes sense.
So, what's our strategy?
Our strategy is a strategy that can only be used by the industrial power in the world, right? So there, at the very beginning of the war, there's this long series of conferences where the Army and the Navy and the aviators, there's no independent Air Force, but there are people in charge of the air components of the Army and the Navy, who all say, we can do it by ourselves. And America can make so much that they just decide, well, we'll all do it. We'll do them all. So there's a submarine blockade that takes a while to get started. By 1944, has sunk most of Japanese shipping and is about to starve Japan. There is an air campaign, which takes a while to get started. It starts in 1943 in China. It will eventually really take off in 1944 once the Marianas are taken. It was aimed as to destroy industry and eventually just to burn down Japanese cities. And there is a two-pronged ground/naval assault, one that MacArthur runs in the south of the Pacific, headed toward the Philippines, one that the Navy runs starting in the Central Pacific over island chains moving toward the Philippines, and they will eventually converge on the islands you'll hear a lot about here in the Philippines, and then Iwo Jima, and then especially Okinawa.
Okay. And we'll put some pictures up here,
Yes.
too. So look for pictures.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in the book, and one of the things, well, the first time I read this book, I think one of the things that surprised me the most is he sort of unproblematically levels the accusation that Roosevelt knew about Pearl Harbor but didn't do anything because he really wanted to get into the war with Germany. Should we be a little bit skeptical about that?
We should be a lot skeptical about that. That's, I think, there's a lot of speculation about that, especially in the 50s and 60s.
Mm-hmm.
Mostly because there are so many hints in the day or two or three before or in the hours before Pearl Harbor that this is going to happen, that people think that Roosevelt could not have possibly missed these, and the American Intelligence Service could not have possibly missed those. So there must have been a reason why they ignored them.
It's always easier to pick up a trail after the fact.
Exactly.
Because you can separate out all the noise and just trace the signal.
And in fact, that's what historians now believe, is that there was so much noise that the signals got lost in the noise. And while looking backwards, you could see it. Yeah. Looking forwards, it was almost impossible to see.
That was the case with 911.
Exactly.
It was the case with the levee in New Orleans when it broke. It's easy to go backwards when you have a bright trail and it's clearly marked. Much harder. Yeah. But Roosevelt did want to get into the war with Germany.
Yes. Oh, he was trying really hard to get into the war with Germany, but he had no interest in getting into the war with Japan.
Right.
It was not actually clear that Germany and America would go to war just because Japan attacked the United States. That actually took the German leader, Adolf Hitler, making an extraordinarily bad snap decision that he was going to go to the aid of the Japanese allies. Otherwise, we don't know whether there would have been a German-American war.
Yeah. Okay, so let's look more at the memoir here.
Yeah. And so actually, let me ask you, what, as a literary person or somebody who teaches literature, what do you understand the word memoir to mean?
It's a really big term, and it can be applied to things that are almost straight history, but it can also be applied to very creative nonfiction. Some of the great memoirs of the past, probably the most famous early memoir is the Confessions of St. Augustine, where Augustine talks about all of the different ways he tried to find meaning in his life, and finally he came to Christianity after going through education, after going through sexual experimentation, after going through whatever passed in the Roman Empire for drug use. He tried it all, and then he comes to Christianity, and it's a wonderful book. I mean, Confessions of St. Augustine is a wonderful memoir, but it's very selective. It's very creative. Rousseau's Confessions, another great memoir, where you have just a lot of very honest, somewhat neurotic discussions of his past. Two wonderful memoirs came out of the 19th century. The Education of Henry Adams, which was by John Adams' great-grandson, John Quincy Adams' grandson, who became a professor at Harvard, and just did a wonderful memoir talking about, he knew Lincoln. He worked with Lincoln. He knew all the big heavy hitters, and detailed all of this in a way that it's one of the best books I've read to give me a sense of what early America was like. And it was a very creative memoir. Ulysses S. Grant wrote a brilliant memoir. He turned it in the day he died. He literally gave it to his publisher and went home and died about the Civil War. And it was much more factual, much less interpretive. So memoirs can really run the gamut. Generally, though, they're not quite the same as autobiographies. An autobiography starts at your birth and goes up to the current time, and it tries to be kind of expansive. Memoirs tend to be about specific events. Most presidents, as soon as they leave office, get a $10 million contract to write their presidential memoir, or to give interviews to a ghostwriter who will write the presidential memoir for about 10% of the profits.
So there's no requirement to be linear in terms of time. What
Not
kind of
at all.
expectations are there for accuracy and details?
Memoirs have a stronger expectation for accuracy than novels do. They don't always meet it. And as a matter of fact, a lot of novels are called the memoir of. Fanny Hill is the memoir of a lady of pleasure. Well, it was a novel in the 18th century. Robinson Crusoe was originally marketed as a memoir by Defoe. He was the editor. And it was believable because Defoe edited a lot of other people's memoirs. And finally, he just decided to cut out the middleman and write a novel. So the English novel, owes its existence to the fact that there were a lot of memoirs that continued to stretch the truth. And then eventually novelists like Defoe, Fielding, Richardson, wrote memoirs without an actual subject. And that's how the novel was born. So the novel comes out of the memoir tradition.
You said something interesting there. You said stretching the truth. This is so the background to this, of course, is that this is the first memoir we've read, right? We've read two novels before this. Now we're looking at a memoir. And so one of the questions you should be thinking about in your head is if we're looking at how people remember combat, how do the expectations and requirements of the genre of memoir shape their memory of combat in ways that are different or similar to the expectations of writing a novel, right? And so I asked you about accuracy, and you talked about stretching the truth. Is there a sense in which memoirs can be truthful without being accurate? Or is that the province of novels?
There's not a bright red line between the novel and the memoir. A lot of very good memoirs have accuracy issues. And sometimes they become very problematic. You may remember a few years back, Stephen Fry wrote a memoir called A Million Little Pieces, or was it 1,000 Little Pieces? Some number of little pieces. And it got picked up by the Oprah Book Club, and he went around, and finally it turns out that he fabricated some of the events. And he actually says he pitched it as a novel, but the publisher published it as a memoir because they thought it would sell better. Because people like the idea of things really happening.
Yeah.
So a lot of memoirs have those kinds of additions. It is a creative genre. A lot of novels have a lot of truth in them. A lot of novels. Hemingway's novel has a lot of truth. A lot of autobiographical truth in it, and some novels are almost entirely autobiographical, with just the names changed. And this would be the confessional novels of people like Thomas Wolfe, Look Homeward Angel. That is just straight autobiography, but he changes the name of the character, and that changes the expectation. So the memoir has a higher expectation for accuracy, but it doesn't always deliver. And I can think of many examples where there are novels that are more accurate than memoirs. And I can think of a lot of memoirs that are better fiction than a lot of novels.
Yeah, there's one scene in particular in this, at least in the section that you all have read for today, that I read and I thought this has got to be fiction. And that's this bizarre scene where he's talking about the horror of battle or the horror of death or whatever.
Horror of Death,
Thank
yes.
you. What remind us of what that scene is about?
And this is on page, if you want to follow along, I'm not going to read it because it's naughty. 72 and 73, but don't read it because it's naughty.
Yes.
Now they'll all read it.
There you go.
Yeah. He's in a battle situation, and he starts to feel sexually aroused, and he has, I think it's one of those visions.
Yeah.
He says a vision of the whore of death, who is this extremely attractive woman who
Who appears
seduces
over
him,
the battlefield
who appears over the
and
battlefield.
looks at him seductively, dressed like you would expect a co-ed, right? The old term for a woman college student to be dressed in Massachusetts, and yet when he actually looks at her, is this bizarrely horrible kind of death figure that is beckoning him, and he can have the sexual release he's been longing for, but only if he dies.
And there's a long history of war and eroticism. I mean, there's a scene in Patton, which is my favorite World War II movie, actually. George C. Scott's Patton. I don't even know if it's accurate, but
Never seen it?
Never seen it?
No.
Come on. So Patton, this is after a big shelling. He's just had a big battle with German tank guy. What's the German tank guy's name?
Rommel.
That's the one. Except Rommel wasn't actually there, but he bombs and he wins and he goes out to this charred battlefield and there are burned tanks and dead people lying all around, and he just goes out here and he says, "I love this. God help me. I love this." And, it's a moment of sexual ecstasy, and it's associated with war. So I think that connection, we see that connection all the way back to the Iliad, which, the main struggle in the Iliad is that Agamemnon takes Achilles' prostitute, his war bride, as his own.
And I think it's worth remembering that element of sexuality and attraction in battle gets presented differently depending on the accepted kind of standards of the time, because you kind of saw that in Remarque.
Yeah.
But it was cloaked.
Well, and also A Farewell to Arms is a sex story as much as it's a war story. Here, with this vision, I mean, there are three possible ways to read it, I think. Either he's crazy, or on drugs, or somehow impaired, or the horror of death really did appear to him, or he's using a literary device to try to express some truth, even though it might not be accurate. He's trying to express some level of truth about the sexual attraction of battle in a way that resonates with people. I'm going to go with number 3. I'm pretty sure the horror of death didn't appear to him.
Yeah.
Drugs are a possibility.
Oh, yeah.
I mean,
it's worth remembering that all armies, but the American Army as well, provided its soldiers with amphetamines throughout the war in order to keep them alive, right? Yeah. So that they didn't fall asleep when they were on post, or that they would be quicker and stronger. I don't actually think amphetamines are likely to make you imagine the horror of death, but...
Yeah, and I don't think, he's so confessional in here, I think if he'd have been tripping on something else, he would have told us, because he tells us a lot of other things he shouldn't have been doing.
So that's one of the scenes of battle in the section you've read for today. But much of the section you've read for the day is actually background material, right? It's about stuff before he ever gets to the battlefront in the Pacific. Why? He spends probably 100 pages. What's he want to do that for?
Well, I think this is, you look at the title, Goodbye Darkness. It's a title that expresses some movement. It was dark, now it's not dark anymore. So there's movement, and there's a sense that the war changed him into something else. But we can only see that if we can see what he was.
Yeah. And in fact, one of the ways you could read this first section of the book is that, in fact, he gets changed from what he was into somebody else, and the force that changes him is joining the Marine Corps. It's not the war; it's the Marine Corps that creates in him something new and provides him with a family and a context and a culture in which he can become somebody else. Right? So his father was a soldier. His father was wounded. His father comes back, having been poorly treated by the doctors who treated him, right? And so already Manchester's got this ambivalent relationship with the armed forces, and yet comes back as a war hero from World War I, and we talked about this last time, right? And Manchester lays out how he was this uncomfortable child who didn't fit in his family and didn't fit in his school and got beaten up regularly. And it wasn't until the Marine Corps, which he joined for reasons that I think are probably not entirely clear to him, although he lays them out. I'm not sure he really believes it. And now all of a sudden he's found a home.
Yeah.
Right. And in fact he describes his the raggedy ass Marines. That's his unit. And this kind of unconventional group of people who didn't fit anywhere else in the Marines, but he fits.
Yeah.
And this is his family.
That's the band of brothers.
Exactly.
So he finds he finds a peer group.
Yep.
That is meaningful to him, and that becomes the motivation for fighting.
Yeah.
What?
And I think, well, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, what do we do with the fairly large amount of description of other forms of sexuality? He tries to lose his virginity. There's quite a bit of description about a homosexual soldier and all of the problems that he faces. Why does he dwell so much on that as part of his growing up, as part of what he tells us? Because he has to be selective.
Yeah.
Why does he tell us those things?
So one way. So I don't think this is the point I want to get to, but one interpretation is just that he's 20 years old and he's a male, and this is what he was thinking about. But of course, the person writing it,
the person writing it had to choose what things to put in.
So I think this fits in more broadly to the vision that the young man is having, right? That he's putting into the mind of the young man, right? That America is going to be a better place. And if you remember, right, he's trying to lose, the fact that he's trying to lose his virginity suggests, in fact, that the world he lives in is not the world he's living in the 70s when he's writing this book, or late 60s.
He's not very good at it.
No, he's not very good at it. He fails, right?
Yeah, right.
Or he fails for all intents and purposes. But he fails because he's not expected to succeed. He doesn't try until he knows he's going off to war and he's not going to get another chance, maybe.
Right.
And he gets connected with somebody who feels, right, he gets hooked up by a friend of his. And the woman kind of confesses that, I'm sorry, but I've been with a couple guys before, and I'm probably kind of implicitly, I'm probably not good enough for you. Which is exactly the kind of world he wants to remember in this book, a world in which girls like that weren't good enough for guys, and guys didn't lose their virginity when they were 14 or 15 or 16. They waited until they went to war. I don't know, but I would guess that the long section about homosexuality is meant to represent that same kind of thing, that this was a world in which this was shocking and not customary.
And he sort of likes that world.
Yeah, exactly.
So there's a reactionariness to the novel that we had this war, and then we had a lot of changes in society, and they produced a different kind of society, and I kind of liked the old one.
Oh, yeah. I more than kind of liked it.
Yeah.
And that's the war I fought for. That's the world I fought for. And and think about all, now, you haven't quite gotten to this, right? So I guess what I would say is, as you read the second half of the book, try and get a sense of what he sees himself losing.
It's just sort of a get off my lawn kind of, you young'uns.
Yep.
Okay. Well, I think we are about out of time.
I think so.
So we will we make sure you go to the quiz, go to the bulletin board, and we will see you.
And we will put a short excerpt from a PBS series that should give you some visuals of Guadalcanal. I'm not so interested that you memorize the history behind it, but we want you to get a sense of what this was like visually as a background, so and finish the rest of the book. Especially make sure you read all of the material at the end of the book.
Yeah, just like the opening quotations, the last bits are really important.
And we will talk about them next time.
All right. Thank you very much.